if you think you can safely go back into the area, I would request that you do so. 8 feet up in the water too, so I don't know whether I can do it or not. I'll give it a try, but that's all I can do.
46 years ago today, the S-S Edmund Fitzgerald sank in Lake Superior. All 29 crew members aboard died.
After the end of World War II, the very same shipyards that had built destroyers and battleships began forging steel giants for the domestic commerce of the United States. One of them was the S-S Edmund Fitzgerald, the largest freighter on the Great Lakes and an emblem of American industrial power. But in November of 1975, this colossus vanished without a trace. 29 men perished without issuing a single distress call. Half a century later, a new investigation led by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration revealed fractures in the hull that do not match the official reports from 1977. Declassified documents from the FBI and the Oglebay Norton Company point to omitted repairs and internal warnings that were never communicated to the captain. Underwater drone imagery shows damage that occurred prior to the storm, suggesting that the Fitzgerald was already sailing in a compromised condition before leaving port. Some experts maintain that commercial pressures kept it operational despite the risks. What for decades was considered a natural disaster may have been the result of human decisions carefully concealed. This documentary reveals the new forensic evidence, the declassified reports, and the voices that are reopening the mystery of the most haunting shipwreck in the Great Lakes. The expedition that revealed the truth hidden in Lake Superior. In the heart of the North American continent, between the United States and Canada, stretches a vast system of fresh water known as the Great Lakes. These immense waterways, connected to one another, were for decades the axis of American heavy industry. Through them was transported the iron ore, coal and steel that fed the nation's factories and shipyards. In those waters sailed true titans of domestic commerce, freighters nearly 300 meters in length that plied the iron routes with military precision. Among them all, none achieved the fame, nor the mystery, of the S-S Edmund Fitzgerald, pride of the fleet and protagonist of the most unsettling shipwreck in the history of the Great Lakes. On the 29th of July of 1994, a yellow submersible named Delta descended toward the depths of Lake Superior. On board were Frederick Shannon and Rick Mixter, a 31-year-old cameraman who would document an expedition destined to change his life. The objective lay 530 feet beneath the surface, in dark and icy water that had not revealed all its secrets since that night in November of 1975. At 300 feet of depth, sunlight ceased to penetrate the lake's waters. The darkness became absolute. Mixter, lying face down inside the submersible, watched as the condensation from his own breath accumulated on the vehicle's walls. The external cold, 37 degrees Fahrenheit, turned every exhalation into vapor. For a moment he thought there was a leak. The pilot explained the physical reality. If there were a real hole in the hull, the water pressure at that depth would have cut him in half in fractions of a second. The submersible continued descending in complete silence. The lights remained off to conserve energy. Only the sonar guided the descent through absolute darkness. When the lights were finally switched on, Mixter beheld a lunar landscape of clay and undulating underwater hills. It took him several minutes to realize that the Delta was already resting on the deck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the most famous and mysterious freighter of the Great Lakes. The first thing he distinguished was a massive crack that ran down from the life raft deck to the weather deck. Then he saw two twisted and deformed hatch covers, numbered 2 and 3, painted on them. The team radioed the surface to report their position, convinced they were still over the bow section of the ship. But those hatch covers lay beside the overturned stern, 200 feet away from where they should have been. That first direct observation shattered decades of speculation. The Fitzgerald had not sunk in one piece. The stern section, 260 feet in length, rested completely inverted on the lakebed. Its outer hull showed not a single scratch, no sign that it had grounded on a rocky shoal. The bow, 160 feet long, was embedded vertically into the clay bottom, as if it had collided with the lake bed at considerable speed. Between the two sections, the midship portion of the vessel, nearly 300 feet of metal structure, had simply vanished, disintegrated into thousands of fragments. There was another discovery that day, one that none of the 5 previous expeditions had located. Approximately 20 minutes after Mixter resurfaced, a radio transmission arrived from the bottom. The Delta crew had found the body of a crewman dressed in blue overalls and an orange life jacket. Mixter formed a clear idea of who that man might be, but out of consideration for the deceased's family, he never publicly disclosed the identity. That discovery raised a disturbing question. If that sailor had had time to put on a life jacket and exit from inside the ship, the Fitzgerald had not sunk completely instantaneously. Yet the fact that none of the 29 crew members managed to escape, that no one reached the lifeboats, and that no distress call was ever transmitted indicated that the ship's final collapse was extremely rapid and violent. The images captured by the Delta's cameras offered further clues about the magnitude of the sinking. The taconite, the small pellets of iron ore that formed the ship's cargo, was scattered mainly behind the stern, the rear part of the vessel, and not in front of the bow, its forward end. This dispersion pattern suggested that the sequence of events during the sinking had been far more complex than previously believed. The 1994 expedition marked a decisive moment in the investigation of the disaster. After nearly 20 years of conjecture, researchers finally had direct images of the site where the ship's remains lay. Yet those images, far from solving the enigma, opened new questions about what series of events had caused the destruction of one of the largest and most modern freighters on the Great Lakes of the United States and Canada. To fully understand what happened, it was necessary to go back 19 years in time to an apparently calm November morning in the port of Superior, Wisconsin, when the Edmund Fitzgerald was preparing to set sail on what would be its final voyage. Forged in steel and superstition, the story of the mighty Fitz. At dawn on the 9th of November of 1975, moored at the Burlington Northern Railroad dock in Superior, Wisconsin, the S-S Edmund Fitzgerald stood as a testament to American industrial ingenuity. The ship, 729 feet long, exactly 1 foot less than the maximum allowed to pass through the Soo locks at Sault Ste. Marie, had been designed to squeeze every last cubic foot of permitted capacity. Its beautiful red and white paint, its modern pilot house equipped with the latest nautical technology, and its exceptionally comfortable crew accommodations set it apart from other freighters. Sailors called it the mighty Fitz, and for 18 years it had been indisputably the pride of the American flag on inland waters. The Fitzgerald story had begun almost exactly 18 years earlier, on the 9th of August of 1957, at the Great Lakes Engineering Works shipyard in Detroit. Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company ordered its construction for $8,400,000, an astronomical sum that made it the most expensive freighter ever built up to that point. This marked the first time in history that an American life insurance company had made such an investment in maritime transportation, a decision that reflected the growing economic importance of iron ore transport on the Great Lakes. The construction method used was revolutionary for its time. Instead of the traditional procedure of forming a hull by laying the keel first and building progressively upward from there, the engineers decided to build the Fitzgerald's hull in massive prefabricated sections at different areas of the shipyard. Once completed, these enormous steel sections were floated to the main construction site, where giant industrial cranes hoisted them and assembled them like pieces of a three-dimensional puzzle on a colossal scale. This method had never before been attempted in Great Lakes freighter construction. The ship was named in honor of Edmund Fitzgerald, President and Chief Executive Officer of Northwestern Mutual, who had more than a merely financial interest in maritime transport. His connection to the water was deeply personal and generational. His grandfather, John Fitzgerald, had been a lake captain for decades. All 5 of John's brothers had also devoted their lives to the water. William Fitzgerald, John's son and Edmund's father, had been president of a shipbuilding company. Both John and William had lived to see cargo ships baptized with their names. Edmund Fitzgerald continued this family tradition by having a ship bear his name and by actively participating in port affairs. On the 7th of June of 1958, an estimated crowd of more than 10,000 people gathered to witness the launch of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Edmund Fitzgerald and his wife Elizabeth took their places on an elevated platform near the bow. After the ceremonial speeches and the formal blessing of the vessel, Elizabeth Fitzgerald stepped forward to perform the ancient ritual of christening the ship. She swung a bottle of champagne toward the bow, but the bottle bounced off without breaking. A second attempt produced the same result. The crowd began to murmur uncomfortably. Finally, on the third attempt, the bottle shattered against the steel. The superstitious among the crowd immediately declared that those failed attempts were an unmistakable sign of bad luck. In maritime tradition, failure to break the champagne bottle on the first try had been regarded for centuries as an omen of misfortune. Other signs soon followed that seemed to validate those fears. The ropes securing the Fitzgerald to its platform were ceremonially cut, and the massive new ship began sliding down the greased ramp toward the water. However, the vessel hit the water at a steeper angle than anticipated, creating a gigantic wave that surged violently across the slipway, crashed against the retaining wall, and completely drenched hundreds of spectators. The Fitzgerald rolled precariously in the water, rocking alarmingly, then righted itself abruptly and crashed into the pier on the opposite side. Amid the commotion, a 58-year-old man from Toledo who had driven to Detroit specifically to witness the event suffered a massive heart attack and died on the spot. Despite this irregular debut and the negative omens, the Fitzgerald generated enormous excitement in the maritime community. Ogle Bay Norton, a Cleveland-based minerals firm, immediately signed a 25-year lease agreement and named it the flagship of its Columbia Transportation Division fleet. On the 22nd of September of 1958, the Edmund Fitzgerald, under the command of Captain Bert Lambert, departed the Rouge River bound for Silver Bay, Minnesota, where it would pick up its very first commercial cargo of taconite pellets to be delivered to Toledo, Ohio. That maiden load immediately set a new tonnage record when the Fitzgerald passed through the Soo locks. Captain Newman Larson, who succeeded Lambert, guided the Fitzgerald through an impressive series of seasons that continually shattered records. In 1964, in 45 voyages under Larson's command, the Fitzgerald carried 1,160,952 tons of cargo through the Soo locks. During its career, the Fitzgerald surpassed the 1 million ton mark in a single season 6 times, a feat no other ship had achieved with such consistency. Captain Peter Pulser took command when Larson retired after the 1966 season. Pulser, a colourful character, jokingly referred to himself as the Commodore, since he commanded the flagship of the fleet. Under his leadership, the Fitzgerald continued to raise industry standards. It became the first Great Lakes vessel to exceed 30,000 tons in a single cargo, accomplishing this milestone on 4 occasions during 1968. The following year, the Fitzgerald carried 1,349,404 tons through the Soo locks, setting the highest volume in the 119-year history of the locks up to that point. In the years that followed, the Fitzgerald underwent several significant modifications. In 1969, a diesel-powered bow thruster was installed, dramatically improving maneuverability. The winter layup of 1971 to 72 saw an even more fundamental technological change. The Fitzgerald was converted from coal to oil as its primary fuel, modernizing the entire boiler system. Ernest McSorley, who assumed command in 1972, was effectively captaining a transformed and modernized ship. Born in 1913 in Ogdensburg, New York, Ernest Michael McSorley had spent his youth dreaming of working on the big ships he watched sailing majestically on the nearby St. Lawrence River. At 18, he took his first job as an ordinary seaman, but soon discovered his true calling was on the inland lakes. In 1951, at the age of 38, McSorley was named captain of the Carrollton. He was the youngest active captain on all the Great Lakes, an achievement that reflected both his technical skill and his maturity as a leader. In 1970, McSorley was placed in charge of the Armco. The first officer of the Armco was Jack McCarthy, McSorley's old friend of many decades. 2 years later, when McSorley was offered command of the Edmund Fitzgerald, he naturally invited McCarthy to join him as first officer. McSorley was 59 at the time, McCarthy only a few months younger. Together, the two men had nearly 74 years of combined experience in lake commerce shipping. Those who worked with McSorley found him difficult to define as a personality. He neither drank alcohol nor smoked tobacco, habits unusual among sailors of his generation. He was quiet by nature, not given to extensive fraternizing with his crew. McSorley strictly kept his professional and private lives separate. Only those closest to him knew that his wife Nellie had suffered a debilitating stroke and now lived permanently in a nursing home in Toledo, or that McSorley was seriously considering early retirement so he could spend his final years caring for her. John Henkel McCarthy, 62 years old in November of 1975, was rapidly approaching the end of his long career on the lakes. 4 full decades had passed since he enlisted as an ordinary seaman on the Yosemite. At some point in his youth, young Jack McCarthy had harbored thoughts of possibly becoming a professional writer. He loved books and had won an essay contest as a child. However, the Great Depression of the 1930s ended any notion of pursuing that literary career. Economic necessity drove him to the water, where he eventually earned his captain's papers. That morning of the 9th of November of 1975, as the Fitzgerald waited alongside the dock in Superior, the day appeared deceptively promising. The weather was unusually mild and almost pleasant. Ship loader Clarence Dennis, known as Ed Dennis, picked up the paperwork for the first assignment of his shift. Dennis would personally supervise the loading of the Fitzgerald. Over the next several hours, the Fitzgerald rarely loaded at the Burlington Northern facility in Superior. Its usual route took it to Silver Bay, Minnesota, and then straight to Toledo, Ohio, earning it the affectionate nickname Toledo Express. This was its first visit of the entire season. The loading proceeded in a completely routine manner. As the taconite was delivered from the storage silos through each of the 21 cargo hatches, crew members armed with portable walkie-talkies constantly monitored for any sign of uneven weight distribution. The draft marks painted on the sides of the hull precisely indicated how deeply the Fitzgerald was settling into the water. The full loading consumed just under 6 hours. The last pocket of taconite was emptied into the hold, completing a cargo of approximately 26,000 tons of ore. The fuel tanks were filled with 50,013 gallons of fuel oil. The dock crew secured the hatch clamps. The Fitzgerald's crew hosed down the main deck with high-pressure hoses. Jack McCarthy personally took the final draft measurements of the ship, obtaining readings of 27 feet and 6 inches aft and 27 feet and 2 inches forward, drafts within safe limits but indicating that the ship was loaded close to her maximum capacity. It was shortly before 2 in the afternoon when the Fitzgerald made her way through the Superior breakwater and out into the open waters of Lake Superior. Her main diesel engine was operating at full power. The Wisconsin shore gradually receded, slowly disappearing into the distance. The Fitzgerald was completely in her element, doing exactly what she'd been designed to do: transport massive quantities of iron ore across the Great Lakes with speed and efficiency. 2.5 hours after the Edmund Fitzgerald departed Superior, another huge ore carrier, the S-S Arthur M. Anderson, left the neighboring port of Two Harbors, Minnesota. The weather was still deceptively warm and the seas remained calm. The Anderson, a 767-foot ship that was technically longer than the Fitzgerald, though with less carrying capacity, was also carrying a full cargo of taconite pellets. Her destination was Gary, Indiana. Captain Jesse Cooper, universally known as Bernie Cooper, a 38-year veteran of working on the water, commanded the Anderson with the same quiet competence that had characterized his entire career. As he steered his ship out of the Two Harbors breakwater, he could clearly make out another large ship on the lake horizon, sailing in the same general direction. Cooper immediately identified the other vessel as the Edmund Fitzgerald. It was a beautiful, clear November day with excellent visibility. However, the weather forecast issued by the National Weather Service was proving to be profoundly misleading. Initially, meteorologists had predicted that a low-pressure storm system moving in from the Great Plains would pass well south of Lake Superior. but an amended forecast issued during the afternoon indicated that the storm had changed course and was now expected to enter the southeastern portion of Lake Superior before heading north toward Canada. Even more worrying, the storm was proving to be deceptively powerful, far stronger than the initial weather models had suggested. Bernie Cooper had barely guided the Anderson fully out of two harbors when the National Weather Service issued a new urgent bulletin, this one specifically calling for gale force winds across the entire Lake Superior. A gale warning was a serious matter, indicating sustained winds of between 39 and 46 miles per hour, with gusts potentially much stronger. The two captains, McSorley on the Fitzgerald and Cooper on the Anderson, discussed the deteriorating weather forecasts at length over the radio. Neither was immediately inclined to dramatically alter his planned course. Both ships were making excellent time, and if they continued traveling at their current pace, they calculated they would be passing south of Isle Royale just as the unpleasant conditions were expected to begin. The land mass of Isle Royale would provide substantial shelter from the anticipated northwesterly winds. Neither captain took the gale force wind forecast lightly. Both were experienced mariners who understood perfectly that wind speed, the duration of sustained winds, and the fetch, the distance of open water over which the wind travels without obstruction, collectively determine the size and power of the waves. The current forecast meant sustained winds of approximately 39 to 46 miles per hour. It also indicated that the storm would last well into the afternoon of the following day, more than enough time for the seas to build progressively to dangerous heights. On Lake Superior, with its enormous fetch of more than 300 miles in some directions, sustained winds of that speed could generate waves of 20 to 30 feet or more. What neither of the two captains knew was that the National Weather Service was dramatically underestimating the actual intensity of the approaching storm. The winds would eventually reach speeds far higher than forecast. The waves would grow to heights that would exceed even the most pessimistic estimates, and in less than 24 hours, one of those two ships would have vanished completely beneath the turbulent waters of Lake Superior, taking with it 29 men in what would become the most famous and mysterious maritime disaster in the entire history of the Great Lakes. The perfect storm, the final hours of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Shortly before 1 o'clock in the morning of Monday, the 10th of November of 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald transmitted its regular weather report to the National Weather Service. The report painted a picture of rapidly deteriorating conditions. Rain was falling heavily over Lake Superior, dramatically reducing visibility. Northeast winds had been measured at 52 knots, equivalent to nearly 60 miles per hour, already significantly exceeding the initial forecasts. Waves approximately 10 feet high were regularly striking the ship's side. The air temperature had dropped precipitously to 37 degrees Fahrenheit. The Fitzgerald reported its position as approximately 20 nautical miles south of Isle Royale. During the following hours, weather conditions worsened progressively and relentlessly. The wind howled through the ship's superstructure. Ever larger waves slammed against the Fitzgerald's bow, some powerful enough to send spray and solid water, called green water by sailors, sweeping over the entire length of the main deck. The crew secured everything that could move or come loose. In the wheelhouse, McSorley and McCarthy constantly monitored the nautical instruments, maintaining regular communication with the Anderson and other vessels in the area. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Monday, something remarkable happened. The weather broke momentarily, and the Fitzgerald sailed briefly under significantly improved conditions. It had entered the eye of the storm system, a zone of relative calm at the center of the rotating weather system. The ship had altered course to the south about 1 hour earlier, beginning the long run down the lake toward Whitefish Bay. Although still facing considerably heavy seas, the Fitzgerald was maintaining its cruising speed without apparent difficulty. Bernie Cooper of the Anderson kept frequent communicative contact with McSorley regarding their respective plans. Cooper anticipated extremely strong winds, possibly of hurricane force, once the storm had moved farther north. As a precaution, he favored putting extra distance between the Anderson and Michipicoten Island. McSorley expressed his preference to remain on his currently planned course, though he casually mentioned that the Fitzgerald was experiencing some lateral rolling. At 3:35 in the afternoon, McSorley radioed the Anderson with a deeply troubling report. The Fitzgerald had suffered significant damage. McSorley reported that he had a toppled rail, some vent covers completely torn off the deck, and that the ship had developed a bad list to starboard. Cooper immediately asked whether the Fitzgerald's bilge pumps were running, and McSorley confirmed that both main pumps were operating at full capacity, trying to remove water that had evidently entered the ship. Cooper detected genuine concern but not immediate alarm in the Fitzgerald captain's voice. Cooper's mind instantly began analyzing possible causes of the damage. A rail simply did not collapse spontaneously during a storm, no matter how severe. Such structural failure required an extreme change in mechanical stress on the ship's structure, the kind of dramatic change that could occur if the ship's hull were flexing violently. McSorley ended the conversation by asking whether the Anderson could follow the Fitzgerald for the rest of the lake crossing, and stated his intention to reduce speed so the Anderson could catch up. Cooper confirmed he would do his best. This request was significant because it indicated that McSorley recognized his situation was potentially serious, and that he valued having another large ship nearby in case conditions worsened. Shortly after his communication with the Anderson, McSorley attempted to use his radio direction finder to obtain a precise bearing on the Whitefish Point light. This lighthouse, one of the oldest and most important on all of Lake Superior, had been guiding ships for more than a century. However, the storm had knocked out electrical power throughout the surrounding region, and the light was operating on limited emergency power. McSorley radioed the Coast Guard station at Grand Marais and specifically asked whether the Whitefish Point radio beacon was functioning normally. Gary Wigan, who was filling in for the regular radioman, had no definitive information on the operational status of the beacon system. Instead of waiting passively for an answer, McSorley sent out a general radio call to any vessel in the immediate vicinity of Whitefish Point. The transmission was answered by Captain Cedric Woodard of the Avafors, a 490-foot Swedish freighter that had just departed Whitefish Bay. Woodard reported that between intermittent blasts of heavy snow, he could make out the structural outline of the lighthouse tower. He confirmed, however, that the light itself was not operating. Woodard then asked with whom he was speaking. McSorley identified himself by name. Woodard was genuinely surprised. He had personally known McSorley for approximately 15 years. The voice he was hearing now did not sound at all like McSorley's characteristic voice that he knew so well. Woodard would later describe the voice as deeply altered, as if McSorley had a severe cold or was exhausted. Woodard was even more startled when McSorley abruptly interrupted their conversation to shout an urgent order to someone else in the Fitzgerald's wheelhouse. The order, delivered with considerable intensity, explicitly forbade any crew member from going out onto the main deck. This prohibition indicated that conditions on deck were extremely dangerous. At 4:10 in the afternoon, approximately 35 minutes after his first damage report, Captain McSorley radioed the Anderson again. This time he reported an additional critical loss of capability. Both of the Fitzgerald's radar systems had completely failed. Radar was absolutely essential for safe navigation, especially in conditions of reduced visibility. Without functioning radar, the Fitzgerald was effectively sailing blind. McSorley asked whether the Anderson could provide continuous navigational assistance. Morgan Clark, the Anderson's first mate who was currently on watch in the wheelhouse, agreed without hesitation. The damaged ship was approximately 3 to 5 nautical miles east of Caribou Island, with a long and dangerous passage still ahead. The waves had increased to heights of 10 to 15 feet. Sustained winds exceeded 60 miles per hour, with measured gusts of more than 70 miles per hour. During the following hours, the Anderson provided continuous navigational guidance to the Fitzgerald, with frequent position updates transmitted by Radio Clark and Cooper, took turns monitoring the Anderson's radar, carefully tracking the Fitzgerald's signal. Conditions continued to deteriorate relentlessly. The wind increased to speeds that exceeded anything the forecasts had predicted. The waves reached heights that Cooper would later estimate at 25 to 35 feet. Snow began to fall heavily. Around 7 o'clock in the evening, Cooper returned to the Anderson's wheelhouse after a brief absence. The ship was struck by two of the largest and most powerful waves Cooper had ever experienced in his nearly 4 decades on the water. The first wave completely flooded the Anderson's boat deck with solid water, hitting it with enough force to shove the starboard lifeboat against its davits, bending metal and damaging the boat's bottom. The second giant wave put green water over the Anderson's bridge deck, approximately 35 feet vertically above the ship's normal waterline. Cooper had never seen waves large enough to reach that height on a fully loaded freighter. Cooper immediately wondered, with growing horror, whether those same monstrous waves had struck the Fitzgerald at the exact same moment. If the Fitzgerald, already damaged, already taking on water, riding lower in the water than normal due to its starboard list, was hit by waves of that magnitude, the consequences could be catastrophic. At 7:10 in the evening, 20 minutes after the Anderson had been hammered by those monstrous waves, Morgan Clark called the Fitzgerald on the radio telephone. He had detected on radar a large target approximately 19 nautical miles directly ahead of the Anderson's position. Clark quickly calculated that the unidentified target was about 9 nautical miles ahead of the Fitzgerald's position. He reported this information to McSorley. McSorley immediately asked if his current course would safely clear the other vessel. Clark confirmed that the Fitzgerald's course would carry it safely west of the unidentified target. McSorley expressed his relief with a brief reply. Clark then added, almost casually, one additional question. He asked how McSorley was doing with the problems he had reported several hours earlier. McSorley replied with 2 words that would be the last ever heard from any of the 29 souls aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald. He simply stated that the ship and crew were holding their own. Clark answered affirmatively and said he would be in touch again later. Then he hung up the radio telephone. Those were the last words anyone ever heard from the Edmund Fitzgerald. There was no distress call. There was no time for McSorley or any other crew member to reach the radio telephone or transmit an emergency signal. The final sequence of events occurred with overwhelming speed. The first immense wave struck the Fitzgerald from its port quarter, a wall of water estimated at more than 30 feet high that completely overwhelmed the ship, driving the bow far below the lake's surface. The forward cargo hold, already severely overloaded to its absolute limit by water that had entered over the previous hours, flooded massively with additional water. More than 26,000 tons of taconite pellets began shifting rapidly forward, following gravity toward the front of the ship that was now sharply angled downward. A second giant wall of water rolled immediately over the submerged ship, ensuring that the bow of the Edmund Fitzgerald would never fight its way back to the surface. The combined weight of the embarked water and the shifted cargo created a downward force that no amount of buoyancy or engine power could overcome. Everything happened too fast for anyone on board to do anything more than react instinctively. The forward windows of the wheelhouse shattered violently. Massive torrents of water invaded the pilot house, hurling McSorley, McCarthy and anyone else present toward the rear bulkheads. The forward portion of the ship, now angling ever more steeply downward, pitched and twisted unnaturally. At the stern of the ship, the main propeller continued turning normally during these final moments, as the propulsion systems in the aft engine room had not yet been compromised. This continuing propulsion force, combined with the massive weight of the flooded bow pulling downward, created tremendous mechanical stresses on the ship's midsection. The center of the Fitzgerald's hull bowed grotesquely under these opposing forces. The ship plunged toward the depths in absolutely dark and icy water, with all its navigation lights still burning. Every pocket of trapped air in various compartments was progressively filled with freezing water. The midsection of the ship twisted and writhed grotesquely under stresses that exceeded anything it had been designed to withstand. The bow crashed into the clay bottom of Lake Superior with tremendous kinetic force, ploughing violently through several layers of soft mud, leaving a deep gouge approximately 30 feet into the lake bed. Although the Fitzgerald was sinking in relatively deep water, the ship was longer than the vertical depth of the water at that point, and as a direct result, its stern section temporarily remained on the surface, even after the bow had already impacted the bottom. The stern finally succumbed to gravitational forces, rising dramatically out of the water with the propeller still turning before disappearing finally and completely beneath the turbulent surface. The icy water flooded massively into the rear of the ship, striking the superheated boilers in the engine room and instantly triggering a series of violent steam explosions. The 21 hatch covers were blown off their mounts by the forces involved. The ship's 2 lifeboats broke free from their davits, and rose rapidly toward the surface far above. The Fitzgerald finally broke completely into two main sections. The extreme torque applied to the middle of the ship twisted the stern structure until it was upside down, when it violently tore away from the rest of the vessel and fell separately to the lake bottom. The bow section, already settled on the bottom, came to rest in its final position. Within the scattered and shattered remains of the Edmund Fitzgerald, 29 men lay dead or in the process of dying. In a matter of minutes, perhaps no more than 5 to 10 from the moment the first giant wave struck until the moment the stern vanished beneath the surface. One of the finest, largest and most modern ore carriers on the Great Lakes had become a permanent grave for everyone on board. And on the surface of the lake, amid the roaring waves and falling snow, no one had the slightest idea what had just happened. No signals, no lights, the night the Fitzgerald vanished. The storm showed some slight signs of breaking just about the time the Edmund Fitzgerald lost its final battle. The heavy snow stopped temporarily and the skies partially cleared. The lake was still heaving violently with waves of 20 to 25 feet, and strong wind gusts continued to shake the superstructure of the Arthur M. Anderson. But for everyone aboard the freighter, psychological relief was finally in sight. It had been an utterly hellish voyage, but Bernie Cooper, Morgan Clark and the others on the Anderson could genuinely feel that the absolute worst of the storm was finally behind them. Cooper, who had been temporarily away from the wheelhouse, had returned to his command position, staring intently through the windows into the darkness ahead. He could clearly see navigation lights in the distance, belonging to 3 saltwater freighters heading up the lake. The 3 ships, the Nanfree, the Aberforth and the Benfree, were all leaving Whitefish Bay after having waited there for the worst of the storm to pass. What deeply troubled Cooper were the lights he did not see. Cooper asked Clark about the Fitzgerald's location. No one had actually seen the Fitzgerald visually for many hours. The Fitzgerald had disappeared from the Anderson's radar when the extreme intensity of the storm had flooded the radar screen with interference. But now, with the snowstorm dissipating significantly and visibility greatly improved, the Fitzgerald's characteristic lights should have been clearly visible somewhere between the Anderson's position and the lights of the 3 saltwater freighters. At the very least, the Fitzgerald should have reappeared on the Anderson's radar screen. It was nowhere to be seen. There were no visible lights where the Fitzgerald should have been. There was no radar return indicating its presence. The ship had simply vanished. Cooper wrestled internally against his growing fears. The Anderson's last communication with the Edmund Fitzgerald had been only about 20 minutes earlier, and according to Morgan Clark's account, Captain McSorley had given no indication that the Fitzgerald was in immediate danger of sinking. There had to be an alternative explanation. Cooper and Clark grabbed their high-powered binoculars and methodically scanned the horizon in all directions. Cooper asked Clark to work more intensively with the radar equipment, while he personally tried to raise the Fitzgerald on the radio telephone. The radio telephone picked up absolutely nothing but dead air and occasional static. This significantly deepened Cooper's growing concern. Cooper, now genuinely alarmed, asked the William Clay Ford whether there was any chance the Fitzgerald had already reached Whitefish Bay without the Anderson knowing. The Ford replied negatively. No one had seen the Fitzgerald. Cooper, anxiety now turning into real dread, contacted the other ships in the area asking if any had seen or had radio contact with the Fitzgerald. All produced negative results. A grim sense of terrible reality now settled heavily over the Anderson's wheelhouse. In all likelihood, the Edmund Fitzgerald had gone beneath the waters of Lake Superior. Cooper called the Coast Guard station at Sault Ste. Marie. Marie, using radio channel 16, the international distress frequency constantly monitored for emergencies. When he finally reached the station, Cooper was in for a surprise. The Coast Guard personnel did not seem particularly concerned or alarmed by the report of the missing Fitzgerald. 38 minutes after his first contact with the Coast Guard station, Cooper contacted the station again. This time he was considerably more direct and forceful. He explicitly stated that he was very worried about the welfare of the steamer Edmund Fitzgerald. He explained that the Fitzgerald had been sailing just ahead of the Anderson, that it had been experiencing significant difficulties, that it had been actively taking on water, and that none of the upbound ships had passed it or had contact with it. Cooper said he could not see the Fitzgerald's lights and did not have the Fitzgerald on his radar. He concluded his transmission with words no one wanted to say, but which reflected the horrible reality. He only hoped the Fitzgerald had not gone straight down to the bottom of the lake, bow first. The options available to the Coast Guard for mounting an immediate search were severely limited. The Naugatuck, a 110-foot harbour tug belonging to the Coast Guard, was currently undergoing maintenance. The present weather conditions were far too extremely severe for it to operate. The weather was also too rough for the Coast Guard's smaller patrol boats to participate in any immediate search, leaving the Coast Guard with virtually no viable option except to contact the large commercial vessels in the area. The closest was the Arthur M. Anderson, which had already reported the Fitzgerald as missing. The Coast Guard's call completely threw Bernie Cooper off balance. The Anderson had finally reached the relative safety of Whitefish Bay when Commander Charles Milrat radioed and asked Cooper directly if he would be willing to immediately turn his ship around and head back out onto the open lake to search for the missing Fitzgerald. Cooper responded with disbelief and understandable resistance. He asked Milrat if the Coast Guard really understood what they were asking him to do. He and his entire crew had just been through the most terrifying experience of their maritime careers. There was no way, he initially declared, that he could reasonably ask his crew to voluntarily return to the hell from which they had just escaped. Milrat persisted, appealing to Cooper's sense of duty and to the remote possibility that there might be survivors in the water. Cooper finally, painfully, gave in to the request. He agreed that he would turn back and take a look at the area where the Fitzgerald had vanished, but he warned Milrat that he genuinely feared the Anderson would take a tremendous beating and that he could not guarantee the safety of his own ship or crew. Milrat was considerably less successful in attempting to enlist other commercial ships. He contacted the captains of 7 different vessels, all currently anchored in or around Whitefish Bay. All but 2 captains flatly refused the request. The William Clay Ford initially rejected the request, but eventually agreed to try to get underway and assist in the search. The Hilda Marjan also valiantly attempted to leave the bay, but after battling extremely high seas for approximately half an hour, the captain reasonably determined that the storm was still too severe, and the Hilda Marjan returned to the protection of the bay. The Coast Guard also dispatched air assets despite the absolutely terrible weather conditions. An HU-16 Albatross aircraft was sent from the Coast Guard air station at Traverse City. The 5 men aboard the HU-16 literally clung to their lives as the aircraft fought through the storm. Violent wind shook the plane brutally. The cloud ceiling hung dangerously low, at approximately 200 feet above the water surface, forcing the aircraft to fly at extremely risky altitudes. Gary Rosenau, one of the 5 men on the HU-16, operated the radar equipment and tried to help the pilot navigate the storm. Years later, when interviewed about that terrible night, Rosenau could not precisely recall how long their search mission had lasted. However, he was absolutely certain of one thing. In the extremely unlikely event that there had been survivors in the water that night, there was virtually no realistic chance that the aircraft would have found them. The search conditions were impossible. Visibility was nearly zero. The waves were so large that any small object would have been completely invisible. The Anderson and the William Clay Ford reached the general area where the Fitzgerald was believed to have disappeared at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday, the 11th of November. The 2 Coast Guard aircraft had already swept the designated area extensively with no sightings. The 2 commercial ships searched methodically throughout the night, while the Coast Guard gradually called in more vessels to join the effort. The storm continued to weaken progressively, and by dawn on Tuesday the conditions had improved sufficiently. For Bernie Cooper, the nighttime search for the Fitzgerald was almost as emotionally harrowing as his earlier adventures in the storm. By this point, Cooper had mentally accepted the worst. Throughout Tuesday, the 11th of November, more debris was located and recovered from the lake, removing absolutely any remaining doubt about the fate of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The Anderson sighted the Fitzgerald's second lifeboat approximately 1 hour after discovering the first, and both of the sunken ship's inflatable life rafts were eventually recovered as well. The condition of the lifeboats and rafts spoke volumes about the circumstances of the sinking. None showed evidence of having been deliberately launched or used. They had clearly broken loose and floated free from the sinking ship. In addition, 20 of the ship's cork life preservers were recovered from the lake. There was no indication that any of these life-saving devices had actually been worn by any crew member. The active search for survivors was officially suspended by the Coast Guard on the 13th of November, after it was determined that there was absolutely no possibility anyone could have survived. Attention then shifted to locating the actual wreck on the lake bottom. On the 14th of November, a Navy Orion patrol aircraft began searching for the sunken vessel using a sophisticated magnetic anomaly detection unit. 15 nautical miles from the shelter of Whitefish Bay. A slight visible oil slick on the water surface directly above that location strongly suggested this was the wreck site. The pilot carefully plotted the exact location and immediately reported it to the USCGC Woodrush. Captain Jimmy Hobor of the Woodrush, equipped with precise coordinates and a sophisticated side-scan sonar system, had a clearly defined new mission: to definitively determine whether the large metallic object detected was in fact the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Within just a few hours of systematic searching, Hobor and his crew were able to independently corroborate the findings of the Orion's MAD system. Something very large was definitely on the floor of Lake Superior at that location, in approximately 530 feet of water. Over the next 2 days, from the 14th to the 16th of November, the Woodrush battled increasingly poor sonar conditions resulting from the approaching storm, but painstakingly managed to produce sonar images that answered some fundamental questions while simultaneously creating new ones. The large underwater target turned out to actually be two large separate objects, each approximately 300 feet long, separated by a short distance. These two main objects would account for a large portion of the Fitzgerald's total length of 729 feet. The sonar also revealed a sonically rough and chaotic area in the space between the two large objects. This debris field, Hobor believed, most likely consisted of the Fitzgerald's spilled cargo and the remains of the destroyed midsection of the ship. It was a promising start, but the Coast Guard Marine Board of Investigation needed considerably more evidence and detail. The use of any kind of underwater photographic equipment was completely out of the question at this time. It was too late in the season, with weather too unstable. The only viable solution was to schedule another sonar exploration later, this time using more sophisticated equipment. The second official visit to the wreck site took place from the 22nd to the 25th of November, barely 2 weeks after the sinking. For 3 full days, the Woodrush worked almost non-stop, making 80 separate passes over the wreck area. Despite these extensive efforts, the best official conclusion anyone aboard the Woodrush could confidently offer was that the wreck was probably the Edmund Fitzgerald. There was not enough absolute certainty for a definitive identification based solely on sonar images. The underwater exploration finally took place in May of 1976, using the Navy's Curve 3. The video footage and photographs confirmed that the wreck was definitely the Edmund Fitzgerald and revealed the extent of the structural damage. The bow was embedded in the bottom, the midsection was completely disintegrated, and the stern lay inverted. However, the images could not definitively answer the fundamental question of exactly what had initiated the catastrophic sequence of events. "50 years of silence, the myth that water cannot extinguish." On Monday, the 18th of November of 1975, just 8 days after the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the United States Coast Guard Marine Board of Investigation convened for the first time in Cleveland, Ohio. The panel, chaired by Rear Admiral Winifred W. Barrow and composed of Captains Adam Zabinski, James Wilson and C.S. Loosemore, set itself an ambitious purpose: to determine the causes of the tragedy, establish responsibilities, and above all propose measures to prevent anything like it from ever happening again. The challenge was enormous. There were no survivors or eyewitnesses to the sinking, nor precise records beyond weather reports and brief radio communications. The only first-hand accounts came from Captain Bernie Cooper and the crew of the Arthur M. Anderson, the ship that had been sailing behind the Fitzgerald that night. Over the following weeks, the board called dozens of witnesses: captains, meteorologists, former Fitzgerald crew members, representatives of the Oglebay Norton Company, and participants in the search. Cooper testified on the 20th of November, just 10 days after the disaster. His testimony, though detailed, was cautious. In a recorded conversation on the 11th of November, he had suggested that the Fitzgerald sailed too close to the shoals of Michipicoten and Caribou Islands. But before the board, he was more guarded, clarifying that his ship had not precisely plotted the Fitzgerald's position. He only had the impression that it was closer to the island than advisable. Investigations into the loading process on the 9th of November revealed no irregularities, but the issue of the hatch covers proved disturbing. Several witnesses admitted that in the industry it was common to secure only half the clamps, especially in summer. Andrew Rajner, the Fitzgerald's longtime first mate, confirmed that Captain McSorley sometimes ordered only every second clamp to be fastened, depending on the weather. When Captain Zabinski asked whether all could be secured in the middle of a storm, Rajner admitted it would be practically impossible. The implication was alarming. If the Fitzgerald had sailed with half the clamps loose, the crew would not have been able to close them when the storm intensified. It would only take one wave to rip off the covers for water to flood the holds and the ship to lose stability. Another critical point was the uselessness of the lifeboats. Veteran seamen testified that, under extreme conditions, it was almost impossible to launch them. Charles Lindbergh, a former Fitzgerald crewman, stated that no lifeboat could have been put into the water in such large seas. Bernie Cooper himself agreed. In such a storm, he said, he would not even attempt it. Richard Orgel, a former third mate, added that the drills were illusory exercises carried out on calm days, with no relation to the reality of a violent nighttime emergency. In his opinion, the idea of launching a lifeboat in the storm of the 10th of November was pure fantasy. These testimonies led to a grim conclusion. Either the Fitzgerald sank so suddenly that the 29 men had no chance to escape, or some knew the end was imminent but chose to remain aboard, aware that the lifeboats offered no hope at all. On the 13th of December of 1975, after 12 days of hearings and 45 witnesses, the board closed its initial phase without definitive answers. Barrow announced that the exploration of the wreck would take place in spring, using the cable-controlled underwater vehicle Curve. 2 years later, in July of 1977, the board published its final report. The most probable cause was massive water ingress through defective or improperly secured hatch covers. The weight of the water would have reduced the freeboard until, battered by gigantic waves, the ship pitched forward, sank abruptly, and broke in two upon impact with the lake bottom. In 1978, the National Transportation Safety Board issued a similar report. Both agreed in pointing to the hatch covers as the main factor. However, the Lake Carriers Association, which represented the shipping industry, maintained that the Fitzgerald had touched bottom near Caribou Island, suffering fatal structural damage. They cited reports of bent railings and torn-off ventilators as evidence of possible grounding. Other experts proposed alternative theories. Some pointed to pre-existing structural failures. George Bergner, who had been a cook on the Fitzgerald for a decade, stated that the ship had problems with a loose keel since the early 70s. He remembered strange creaking sounds and anomalous movements in rough seas. Decades later, researchers like Rick Mixter refuted the grounding hypothesis. The inverted stern of the wreck showed no damage consistent with an impact. According to Mixter, the Fitzgerald most likely broke apart on the surface, victim of a combination of compromised hatches, weakened structure, and monstrous waves. The controversy never dissipated. The only indisputable fact was the loss of 29 lives. Captain Ernest McSorley, 63 years old, his officers John McCarthy, James Pratt, and Michael Armagost, and 25 more crew members, men with families and stories cut short in an instant. A few weeks after the disaster, Canadian singer-songwriter Gordon Lightfoot read an article in Newsweek titled "The Cruelest Month," which mentioned a Chippewa legend, Lake Superior, called Gitchagumi Never Gives Up Its Dead. Moved by the story, Lightfoot wrote The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, a 6-minute ballad that recounted the tragedy with poetic precision. Released in August of 1976, it reached number 2 in the United States and number 1 in Canada, bringing the Fitzgerald story to millions of listeners and turning it into collective memory. In 1995, an expedition recovered the ship's bell, replacing it with a replica engraved with the names of the 29 crew members. The original bell now rests in the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point, Michigan. Every 10th of November it is rung 29 times in their honor, a solemn ceremony that gathers hundreds of people. In 2006, at the request of the families, the Canadian government declared the wreck site a protected place under the Ontario Heritage Act. Diving there without permission became illegal, with fines of up to $1 million Canadian dollars. It was not just a historic wreck, it was a sacred grave. 50 years later, the causes of the sinking remain a matter of debate. Official investigations pointed to the hatches. The industry insisted on grounding. Independent researchers highlighted structural failures aggravated by giant waves. The truth may combine all those factors, a fatal chain of errors, weakened materials, and extreme conditions. What is indisputable is the courage of Captain Bernie Cooper and his first officer Don Erickson, who turned the Anderson around and re-entered the storm to search for survivors. They knew the odds were zero, but they followed the unwritten code of Great Lakes mariners: you never abandon a ship in distress. The Fitzgerald's legacy is reflected in the safety improvements that followed: reinforced hatch covers, more reliable communications, advanced weather forecasting, and revised rescue procedures. Since then, countless lives have been saved thanks to those reforms. But the lesson endures. Even in the modern era, the Great Lakes remain untamable forces. The Fitzgerald was the largest and most modern ship of its time, commanded by a veteran captain, and still it succumbed to the fury of water and wind. Today, 530 feet beneath the surface of Lake Superior, the Edmund Fitzgerald rests in perpetual darkness. Its bow lies embedded vertically in the clay bed, the stern inverted, a short distance away. Between them, the midsection disintegrated, scattering thousands of tons of taconite. There, among the wreckage, rest the bodies of the 29 men who set out one November morning and never returned. According to the ancient Chippewa legend, the lake never gives up its dead. The Edmund Fitzgerald and its crew remain where they fell, as a silent monument to human fragility before nature, to the risks of working on the water, and to the high price of progress. Every year the bell tolls, the names are read, and the song is sung. The lake, vast and mysterious, keeps its secrets as it did that night in 1975, when the waves rose like mountains, and a proud ship vanished without a trace, leaving behind an eternal echo of memory and mystery.